Good morning, and thank you for joining us to discuss the Superpower Institute's latest research, The Case for Pricing Pollution. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. We recognise their enduring connection to land, water, and culture. In February 2024, Garnaut and Rod Sims took the stage at the National Press Club to propose a new approach to pricing carbon pollution, one grounded in economic efficiency and fairness, and to better position Australia for future prosperity. Today's research is the culmination of almost 2 years of research by the TSI team. John Kehoe will be moderating the panel today. John is the Australian Financial Review's economic editor at Parliament House and was the AFR's Washington correspondent covering Donald Trump's first election. He's joined by the chair of the Superpower Institute, Rod Sims, who many of you will know as the former ACCC chair. Dr. Ingrid Burfurd, one of the report's co-authors, also joins the panel, and she is the carbon pricing lead at the Superpower Institute, and prior to joining TSI was at the Grattan Institute. Ingrid holds a PhD in economics from the University of Melbourne. So I'll now hand over to John to moderate the panel. We won't be taking audience questions today, but we will be having a separate policy webinar on Monday, the 2nd of February, featuring Ingrid again and the other co-author of the report, Ruben Finnegan. And there we will have an opportunity for you to put questions forward to the report's co-authors. I'll share these details with you at the end of today's session. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Botham, for that introduction, and pleased to be joined also by Rod Sims and Ingrid Burfurd today, and looking forward to a really meaty policy discussion over almost the next hour. Rod and Ingrid, welcome to you both. The Superpower Institute has launched a new report today, and two key critical elements of it are a polluter pays levy and a fair share levy, raising about $35 billion a year to replace other climate and energy policies currently. We'll dig into the details soon, but Rod, if I could start with you, at a very high level, what's the premise of this policy prescription you've put on the table today, and what problems or challenges is it seeking to address?
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for joining us. The two policies we're suggesting today go a very long way to addressing all three of Australia's major economic problems. Firstly, we're not, on current policies, going to meet our emission reduction targets. Secondly, we've got a huge structural budget deficit, which is constraining the government in all sorts of ways. And thirdly, we've got a productivity problem. And the two policies we're putting forward today essentially address all three of those problems. As you mentioned, we've got a polluter pays levy, which is a levy on sites, about 160 sites in Australia that extract coal, gas and oil, as well as imports of fossil fuels. And we've got a fair share levy, which is a Norway-style levy on the gas industry. In terms of the three challenges, with emissions reduction, at the moment we're doing that in reasonably inefficient ways. Imposing the polluter pays levy is much more efficient. More importantly, it will reduce emissions by a lot more. And I guess the key point about the polluter pays levy, at the moment, we've got measures to reduce emissions that either cost the budget or cost consumers. We believe it's polluters who should pay, and that's how we've structured the system. So your choice is current policies, budget gets hit, households get hit, or a policy where it's the polluters paying. In terms of the budget, we do have a significant structural budget deficit. That's very clear. Some would like that addressed by expenditure reductions. That's really hard because I would guess roughly that the budget deficit will be about 2% higher than what it is now because of the expenditure needs coming over the horizon, such as on defence, on various social policies. So if we can hold expenditure at the current level, in meeting those needs, that's a great expenditure reduction result. So if we're going to affect the structural budget deficit, we're going to have to do it through revenue measures. These revenue measures, the polluter pays levy, the fair share levy, as John says, raise $35 million, $35 billion, get the B rather than the M, billion. And will go a long way to doing that. And I think I would defy anybody to come up with more popular measures. Nobody likes tax increases, but the polling we've done suggests these two measures have overwhelming public support. And then, of course, you've got the productivity challenge. So the measures we're putting today do improve productivity, firstly, because they're more efficient ways to reduce emissions. Secondly, they provide a level playing field in our electricity sector because you're no longer getting those that pollute competing with those who don't pollute. You're putting them on a level playing field where if you do pollute, you pay for it. That, I think, will provide a real incentive for renewable energy, and it will be a significant boost to our electricity generation, which if we don't boost it, we're heading for problems. Secondly, those who want to boost productivity are arguing mainly to do that through tax reform. You just cannot have tax reform unless, in addition to tax reductions, you've got some tax increases. And thirdly, we need to send the right signals throughout our economy for the investment we need in the future. Just a final point, if I could, John. I think anyone who's got concerns with the two measures we're putting today to address the three challenges, it's not as if you do what we're talking about or do nothing. You just cannot do nothing. You've got to do more on emissions reduction, budget deficit reduction, productivity improvement. If you don't like our measures, then explicitly tell us what measures you do like that are preferable to the two levies we're proposing today. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Rod, for that intro and overview. Ingrid, building on what Rod sort of said there, happy for you to give a very high-level take in addition to what Rod said there about why you think this is the direction of travel Australia needs to head in for climate and energy policy, but also be keen to dig into how the actual first one of these levies, the polluter pay levy, would operate too. I think that's the bigger, chunkier one that would raise roughly about $22 billion out of the $35 billion a year.
That's right. So I'll first pick up on the extension to what Rod was talking about at a high level, because I think it's really useful to make sure that when we talk about the polluter pays levy, we also talk about the household compensation and support measures that we strongly advocate are introduced alongside it. So as you said, the PPL will raise on average $22.5 billion a year through to 2050. That's a really substantial amount of money. And what we explicitly recommend is that the government uses a very large share of that to compensate households for any increases in their energy bills. So that's across electricity, gas, and transport fuels. Now, the proposal we've put forward there is worth on average $4.1 billion through to 2050, and at the household level, that's about $330 a year. It peaks in the early 2030s because that's when energy prices are expected to peak. But on top of that, we've also recommended that there is a household support package. That's a much more general form of support for those households that are most exposed to cost of living concerns related to energy. And we're proposing that that's a more progressive, more targeted form of support. So what we're recommending there is $4 billion a year for the first decade of the PPL. And what that means is that, for example, if you were to target that $4 billion to the top 75% of households, that's about $490 a year. If you were to target it more tightly at the bottom 25% of households, that would be over $1,000 a year. And that at that kind of scale and with that kind of targeting, we think we can really alleviate people's broader concerns about not just energy prices, but also broader cost of living effects and help households with the electrification process and bring them along with us as we decarbonise. So that's the first bit. You asked me to elaborate on Rod's general description, and it's really important that whenever we talk about the polluter pays levy, we're also talking about household support. But now turning to this question of, well, what does it look like in a bit more detail and in practice? So as Rod said, it's a levy on companies that import or extract fossil fuels. It's a levy on the carbon pollution embedded in those goods. And so what that means in practice is it's applied to either the importers of, typically in Australia, it's oil and petrol and diesel. On the extraction front, it's typically gas and coal. And I think the easiest way to think about it is with an example. So if you're mining black coal, you dig it out of the ground, and within that ton of coal or a ton of that coal, there's 2.5 tons of future carbon emissions. And so what we're seeking to do is to capture that as high up and to reflect the damage done by that carbon pollution as far upstream as possible. So at those small number of points of import and extraction, because that gives us remarkable coverage, because those fossil fuels then flow through the rest of the economy, and nearly 80% of Australia's emissions are from the combustion of those fossil fuels. So this is a policy that's, we think, quite elegant in its sort of administrative simplicity, but it's remarkably broad coverage. And a final thing before I lose that thread is just that we're also proposing to cover fugitive emissions at the point of extraction as well. So those methane emissions as you actually mine your gas and your coal.
Yeah. Thanks, Ingrid, for that description. Rod, just building on that, essentially it's, I think, targeting the extraction of coal and gas and then the importation of fuel and other things that are very emissions intensive in Australia. It seems to be a little bit more narrowly targeted than the Gillard government's carbon price that they had in around 2012 for a couple of years before it was removed by the Abbott government. What's the thinking behind maybe not the same breadth of actually who's paying this tax directly? And your thoughts. Ingrid said that it still flows through to, I think, capture about 80% of emissions across the economy.
That's right, John. So it's very broad. I think the key point is that it's simple. And we wanted to keep it really simple. And as I think hopefully my explanation and certainly Ingrid shows, it's really easy to explain. You're imposing the levy on fossil fuel extraction and importing where these things are used domestically. I think the one of the problems that the ETS had 2012, 2014 was its complexity. This is simple. That's its big selling point.
And Ingrid, what sort of carbon price, so to speak, per dollar of tonne are we talking about here? I think when the Gillard government's carbon price came in, it was at the time $23 a tonne, and then it was over time going to link, I think, to the European price and float more more like emissions trading. But what would this start at and where would it go to?
What we've recommended is that the price rises gradually over the first essentially decade of its existence, and that from 2034 it meets and then continues to track with the EU carbon price. And so the reason we've chosen the EU carbon price is it's absolutely the largest, the best established market for carbon in the world, and it's the market that best reflects the social cost of carbon. So what you'd see is that gentle trajectory up and then holding with the EU price.
Rod, before we dig into the fair share levy, which I do want to get to too, which is the second leg of the stool, so to speak, on these two new proposals, I did want to get your take on why the polluter pays levy particularly is a superior approach, you're arguing, to a couple of the federal government's current major policies. That is, maybe if we deal with them one at a time, but the capacity investment scheme, as well as the safeguard mechanism. The report identifies some problems with these sort of schemes that are being used. Why is your approach better?
I think our approach is markedly superior, John. If you take the capacity investment scheme, that has the government underwriting the price that the generators under that scheme will get. It covers their debt, so their debt's covered, but doesn't cover their equity. It has the government deciding which projects, where and when they go ahead. So it's not a market system, it's a government-driven system. It has a potentially large contingent liability on the budget. And crucially, John, it's not actually providing an incentive. It's not actually fixing the problem of the fact that some generators, coal generators, are currently being subsidised to stay open. They're not paying for the pollution they cause. So you don't have a level playing field for generation. So it's got problems on every front.
Yeah.
The safeguard mechanism, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, the safeguard mechanism, yes.
The safeguard mechanism is very complex. The government's got to work out what the emission intensity benchmark is that they get judged on going forward. So that's very complex. It covers about 30% of emissions. If you want to extend that, you're going to face even more complexity. And crucially, John, it does not raise any revenue. So as you impose burdens, understandably, to reduce emissions, as you impose those burdens on companies, that has natural flow-on effect to consumers, and there's no mechanism to compensate them. So it's, again, an inefficient scheme compared to the polluter pays mechanism, and it has no revenue to compensate consumers in the way Ingrid described.
And just briefly, Rod, I think the report identifies some problems that these current policies are throwing up, particularly for the electricity sector. Could you just explain that?
Thanks, John. I think that's a really crucial area at the moment. I mean, Australia needs a lot of investment in energy generation. At the moment, the government's trying to keep open some very old coal plants. They are past their use-by date. They do trip quite a lot, which causes prices to spike. So they've got all sorts of problems. What we need to do is get the signals right for generation investment, which means levelling the playing field between generation that pollutes and generation that does not. I think if we do that, we'll have a real incentive to get the renewable. I mean, let whatever generation wants to come forward under that regime come forward. My very confident prediction is you get a lot more renewable generation than you're getting now because you've got a positive incentive to build it. At the moment, you don't.
And Ingrid, picking up on what Rod said there, I know when we had a pre-chat, you were identifying some shortcomings of the safeguard mechanism, I think, which is essentially an industrial cap on, or a cap on industrial emissions across certain sectors. What issues do you see there? And again, per my question, why is this a superior approach?
Yeah, so just quickly, useful to describe what the safeguard is for those who aren't familiar with it.
Yes.
So the goal of the safeguard mechanism is to reduce emissions from Australia's largest emitters. So it captures about 220 facilities that emit 100,000 tonnes of carbon each year or more. And the way it works is that there's an emissions intensity baseline specified for those facilities, and it rakes down through time. It covers about 30% of Australia's emissions. And so, one of our starting points would be that certainly as it functions now, it's very narrow. We know that to reduce emissions at least cost, you want the same broad signal shared across the economy to incentivise those low-cost abatement opportunities where they exist. So the narrowness of the safeguard mechanism at the moment is a problem. Now, of course, you could expand it, but then you run into some of the problems that Rod gestured towards. You run into the challenge of complexity because you have to, and the government has to specify those emissions intensity baselines and the rate at which they decline. But the big one, Rod said it, but I cannot emphasise it enough, so worth restating, is the revenue issue. So, we were talking earlier about the importance of compensating and supporting households. The safeguard mechanism, even if you broaden it, even if you deepen it, does not give you that revenue and that capacity to both compensate and support households, but also to strengthen the budget, to invest in other social policies that we need. And I think, one thing that is really clear is that, and certainly our work looking at voters' responses shows that people are both deeply concerned about the environment, they're really worried about carbon pollution, but that coexists with a concern about cost of living. And so it's going to be crucial if we want to build support for this policy or any policy that meaningfully reduces emissions, that we address both of those concerns together. And that's why the PPL is such a neat package. It allows us to do both of those things in a way that no other alternative on the table allows us to do. So we've done some work with over 3,000 voters, some research, and what we find there is that 68% of those support what we're proposing, the PPL, but that responsiveness to their concerns about cost of living is absolutely crucial. No other mechanism on the table gives us that.
And John, if I could just summarise the polluter pays levy is much more efficient than the safeguard mechanism. It's a lot more effective than the safeguard mechanism, and it raises the revenue. I mean, really, it's a pretty easy comparison to make.
Yeah. The Productivity Commission has suggested expanding it to sectors that are currently exempt. I suspect they probably prefer a more straight carbon price across the economy. Are they being too pragmatic and practical? Should we be aiming for more ambitious A1 policies rather than third or fourth best?
Absolutely, John, we should. We're doing ourselves a disservice as a nation if we go for third or fourth best policies. We've got to go for the first best policy because what these policies are doing is addressing serious challenges. We can't be getting the fourth or fifth best, if I could put it better that way. I think you'll find which we've got on our website, statements from the Productivity Commission, the Garnaut Institute, Rio Tinto, I suspect explicitly favour a price on carbon, and therefore something like we're proposing with the polluter pays levy. They're all there. When I think the Nelson Review on electricity was explicitly constrained from proposing a levy on pollution. I think the Productivity Commission, in terms of its references, has been constrained as well. I suspect if you asked, firstly, everybody involved in the regulation of the energy industry and to do with the energy transition, and we both know any economist who's across these issues, they'll all prefer the polluter pays levy. I mean, it just wins hands down with everybody when they've got a free ability to talk.
And a lot of billions of dollars are being spent on various subsidies to achieve the sort of emissions outcomes. There's the capacity investment scheme, which you mentioned has a big budget contingent liability, a bunch of other sort of subsidy incentives for future made in Australia. They've even, electric vehicle tax breaks, fringe benefits tax free. I mean, in your view, are we sort of throwing too much taxpayer dollars in a sort of command and control way without really getting bang for buck in, effective emissions reduction at a lower cost?
2 points, if I could, John. I think the Productivity Commission, and Ingrid may correct me, have said that the motor vehicle emission reduction policies are close to sort of $20,000 per emission reduction. Now, I could be wrong, but they're hideously expensive, and that's what you get to when you start having these little interventions. So much more expensive for the economy. So yeah, this works out much better for the Australian economy. I guess the second point I'd make is that we're dealing now with getting more efficient investment in the domestic economy. Where that rubber really hits the road is in the electricity industry, which is facing enormous problems at the moment and has faced problems ever since the Gillard proposals went. I mean, as soon as that went, you had all these interventions which have completely destroyed the market. But separately, Australia does have an opportunity to be a major producer of green iron, green fertiliser, green transport fuels that you would export. And yes, it does need a bit of money for the transition to those policies. Those are things in which we do have a comparative advantage. And yes, the government does need to provide a bit of money for those. So we support that. and some of the money being raised here could go to that. I accept, though, John, the Future Made in Australia has got a much wider mandate, and that does run into problems. But where you're dealing with the transition to things we've got a comparative advantage in, which I think we do, all commentators would say, as we move to net zero, it's going to be Australia that's producing the green transport fuels, Australia that's producing the green iron. That's what we should be helping prepare for, not a lot of this other stuff in which we don't have a comparative advantage.
Now, I haven't forgotten about the second leg of this, the fair share levy, and I do want to get to that. But just for the viewers, it is essentially a sort of profits-based tax on largely oil and gas. So we will get to that. But we're just dealing more with the sort of quasi-carbon price, I suppose, through the polluter pays levy at the moment. Ingrid, the report, I think, acknowledges these policies will push up electricity prices. That's obviously politically difficult. You mentioned household compensation. Do you think this could fly politically, though? Because, people are already complaining about high electricity prices. We saw a high inflation number yesterday as well.
Okay, there's two things I'd like to bring up in response to that, John. The first is that before we get into the detail, it's incredibly important to think about what costs we're comparing here. So, first of all, on one hand, we have the cost of doing nothing. Alternatively, we have the cost of a really chaotic, ad hoc, delayed approach to reaching net zero. And of course, both of those are higher than any cost associated with, an efficient, measured, broad-based approach to reaching net zero, which is what we're proposing. So it's important that when we're talking about costs, we're comparing them to the far greater costs that go with any other policy alternative. So let's keep that in mind when we then turn to the question of what happens to energy prices. It's the case that if we put in place a levy on upstream fossil fuels, that will flow through the economy, including to households' cost of petrol and electricity and gas. That is exactly why, for us, it's essential that there's this really generous compensation that makes sure that no household is worse off as a result of increases in their household energy bills. And that's why we're putting an average of 4.1 billion on the table every year on average through to 2050 to make sure that's the case. Now, there are, of course, it's the case that not all households are equally exposed to that. And we recognise that too. We recognise that through time, any policy to reach net zero means that households are going to have to electrify, they're going to have to switch from gas to electricity, from petrol-based cars to EVs. All those things are part of any transition to net zero. But what we're saying is if you introduce a PPL, you have the revenue to offer households not just compensation for the increase in their electricity prices, but also an extra, what we're proposing, 4 billion a year for the first decade to help the houses that are most affected by those broader cost of living concerns and the desire to electrify to better protect themselves against those higher costs. So it is impossible for us to talk about a transition that manages the impact of those costs to households unless we are raising substantial amounts of money as part of that process.
John, I could just, I don't mind. I think we just cannot tie ourselves in knots on what happened 12 years ago. If you go back to that period, which you and I lived through, you had you had changes in prime ministers during that period. There's a lot going on in the economy at that time that had politically negative implications. So how much you attribute the 2014 election to the carbon price, I don't know. But the attack you had on the ETS then, I don't think you can run that attack now. There's more awareness of climate change. As Ingrid said, there's way more compensation than people need here. And I think you now have people understanding we've got to take steps to climate change, and they now have a better understanding of the alternatives. And as Ingrid mentioned, the polluter pays levy has got nearly 70% public support. So if the government's worried about the politics, look at the surveys. It is actually a popular policy. Times have changed.
So you think perhaps that the impact of the Tony Abbott's campaign against the Labor's carbon tax may have been overstated in the sense of the political detrimental impact it had, because, as you say, there were other things going on. There was also the mining tax, the change of prime ministers. It was a pretty chaotic government, to be frank, looking in from the outside. So maybe what you're suggesting is the carbon tax was maybe not as unpopular as folklore would have you believe.
I think 2 points, John. One is, as you say, I mean, sorry, to be blunt, it was a chaotic government. I mean, we have to say that. I mean, there was chaos at that time. And so attributing what led to what is difficult. So anyone who's apportioning the defeat of the government in 2014 to the emissions trading scheme, I think is way overdoing it. And there was some polling that showed it actually wasn't that the ETS wasn't that big an issue. But I'm not debating that. I'm more saying there's a lot going on. I think they were in problems anyway. Secondly, John, they're just not going to get away with saying it's going to increase your Saturday afternoon barbecue by $100. I mean, it just doesn't work anymore. Those lines of attack, I think, have just worn out. People, you could do it back then because you caught everybody by surprise, big change in policy. You could make all sorts of outrageous statements. I don't think you can get away with that anymore. We've come a long way. Back then we threw an emissions trading scheme on a lot of concrete, had no preparation. Now you've got really fertile tilled soil on which the PPL will land, and I suspect it'll land very, very well.
Can I just jump in also to make the point that difficult or policies that feel difficult to implement have been successfully implemented before, even in the face of naysaying. So it is the case that Australia successfully introduced tariffs, which have tremendously lifted Australian welfare and growth through time. It's also the case that we were never ever going to have a GST, and that was taken to an election, and we have a GST. It is possible, with persistence, with good communication, with intent, to pursue and to successfully pursue first best policy. You just have to commit to it.
I think that is the lesson from the tariff reductions, as Ingrid said, John. A long history of tilling the soil until the time was right to do it. And the time is right for the polluter pays levy, and the tariff reductions. A lot of firms disappeared when those tariff reductions came down. I mean, it was a really tough policy to bring in, but the benefits to Australia are absolutely clear.
I mean, it is a bit ironic, I've always found, actually, that I think some of the biggest sort of industry critics of carbon taxes and prices at the time, some in the big business community, the mining community now, so they're some of the ones who are actually advocating for a simple carbon price in the economy. Now, I think where there might be still disagreement would be what's the right level, how much of Australia's contribution should Australia make? And so it might be around the size or quantity of any sort of carbon price or contribution as opposed to the mechanism. But I think there probably does need to be a bit of a reflection even on those interests about, well, given we got rid of a reasonably efficient mechanism to price carbon, we're now going down a very, very expensive and less effective route through this sort of more command and control big government approach.
Couldn't agree more, John.
Couldn't agree more. And also, though, in the context of the scale of what we need to achieve. So just to kind of put what is required in context, between 2005 and 2024, Australia's emissions were reduced on average about 9 million tonnes each year. To land our 2035 targets, we need to more than double that rate of annual reductions. So it is clear that the policies we have in place at the moment are not the policies that can achieve the reductions in emissions that we need. So the question is, what is the best way to go about doing that? What is the policy mix that importantly reassures households that they're not going to be worse off, that charges polluters for the damage that they do, and strengthens the budget in the meantime. I've been talking a lot about our support for households and the value that we put to that, but somehow, I worry that in that story I've perhaps failed to do justice to the fact that, even those really generous packages that we've talked about, it's only half of the revenue that the PPL would raise over that first decade. There is still billions of dollars left over for strengthening the budget, for social policy, for defence, for all of the things an ambitious government might want to do if it's interested in strengthening the economy while it reduces emissions.
That's probably a good segue to the second aspect of the policy proposals you're putting forward, the so-called fair share levy, which I think would raise roughly, give or take, 30% of that overall $35 billion total a year. Rod, to start with you, could you just explain to the audience what the fair share levy is, who it would apply to, how it would operate and replace current sort of arrangements?
It would replace the petroleum resource rent tax, which I think every commentator, apart from the industry itself, of course, but every commentator acknowledges has failed. It just has not raised the revenue anticipated. As we all know, it was designed for the oil industry, which would give you revenue flowing a lot faster than the gas industry. Under the petroleum resource rent tax, those early year losses were taking forward originally at 15% above the government bond rate. So they built up this enormous tax shield, which means the tax revenue coming from the PRRT is, to use the technical term, bugger all. If you look at a table of the governments who are exporting gas, what percent of revenue are they getting? Australia is right down the bottom. So we have this resource. I mean, the gas resources belong to Australia. Australians should get a good return on that, and they're not. So what we're proposing is what's termed a Norway-style cash flow tax. It's where if you have a new gas player, the government would put in 40% of the costs and get 40% of the revenues. So it doesn't have any effect on the incentive to invest, doesn't have any effect on pricing, but it does raise a lot of revenue. It would take our revenue raise from under 30% to just under 60%. Norway is raising 78%, which is about the same as what the UK is raising, which has also got a similar regime. So we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just being hopefully a clever, slightly late follower of what countries that have really benefited from their natural resources have been able to achieve, and we have not. It's about time we did get that benefit. Our budget needs it. The Australian people deserve their fair share of the proceeds from gas, which is why we're calling it a fair share levy.
Ingrid, would you like to add to that?
I was just going to elaborate and to say that what we're proposing is very consistent with the original intent of the PRRT. That's what it was always intended to do, to collect a share of those very large economic rents or returns that gas, in particular gas companies, secure from Australian resources. So we're not introducing a new concept. We're not pursuing a new goal. What we're doing is proposing a mechanism that does a better job of delivering on the original goals of the PRRT. And so the rate that we're proposing is the same. It's still 40%. As Rod pointed out, that is still more generous to companies than some other countries. But it's just the structure of the levy that changes. And in particular, Rod mentioned the fact that there's that uplift that takes place against losses under the PRRT. The effect of the way the PRRT is structured is such that companies can carry forward any losses from year to year, but with uplift. And so that has the effect of creating really what is the easiest way to think about it is a tax shield. So what it means is you can end up in a situation where those companies are earning extraordinarily large revenues, but not paying tax, or not paying a tax that reflects the scale of those revenues, because they've got that tax shield that's been built up through time. So our proposal is in the simplest sense, trying to reset go back to the original goals of the PRRT and just to try and eliminate the effect of that uplift and that carry through so that the Australian public can collect that share of returns that was always intended to sit back with Australians.
It's quite a sharp tax increase because I think the petroleum resource rent tax, give or take, raises only about $1 or $2 billion a year. And for the audience, it's imposed generally in federal offshore waters on petroleum and gas projects, generally not onshore, which is sort of the domain of the states. So we're talking about going from roughly $1 to $2 billion a year to somewhere around $13 billion a year. They pay company tax, sometimes they pay state royalties. I mean, the gas industry might suggest, combined with the other polluter pays levy, they're being very unfairly targeted. This could deter investment in the sector. Gas is a very important transition fuel in the renewable sort of story. Is there a risk that these two new proposals could, in fact, backfire in the sense that it could deter investment in gas if you think that's what's needed for the transition?
No, John. Shortly, just to explain on that. Firstly, I mean, look, the basic point about this is that the survey evidence we've had is that this has 88% support in the population. So I'm very confident in predicting the gas industry will hate it and the rest of Australia will love it. So it's a very popular thing to do. But going to your very serious points, most of the revenue will come from gas exporters, predominantly those, I mean, overwhelmingly those exporting gas. They're not affected by the polluter pays levy. So there's no double up here. They're just getting so they're completely exempt from the polluter pays levy. They're only subject to the fair share levy. And as I say, most of that is exports. I have to mention most of it's foreign-owned companies as well. In terms of the gas we need, I mean, John, we all know there's tons of gas in Australia. I mean, the problem with gas is we have 3 LNG projects in Queensland. There wasn't enough gas for 3 LNG projects in Queensland. So they took gas, which previously was being used domestically, and sent it to their LNG plants and sent it overseas. That's what's caused the shortage of gas in Australia. That's what's caused the very high prices of gas in Australia. If you want to deal with that, that's what you do. It's got nothing to do with the proposal we're putting here. It won't, I mean, if someone wants to invest domestically for gas, this won't affect their incentive to do so. It certainly won't affect the price of gas. Australia, I mean, I'm a big fan of doing more on the gas policy front. Australia pays by far the highest domestic gas prices of any gas exporting country in the world. I mean, by far, by magnitudes. So we've just got to fix that. It's just unfair to domestic companies that still want to use gas. We have to fix it that way. Nothing to do with what we're proposing here, John. I know the companies will say that. If you're the CEO of a gas company, you've got to work to protect your shareholders. But this overwhelmingly has public support, and for a very good reason. It's good policy and it benefits the Australians who actually own the gas resources.
Ingrid, I mean, do you see gas as an important part of the transition to renewables? There is debate about that, or do you see it as more temporary? And building on what Rod said?
All of the work I've seen sees a small role for gas in some peaking. As we get close to net zero, of course, the goal is to drive that down to the lowest share possible. As Rod said, gas is currently an incredibly important input for Australian businesses, but it is important to be clear, the fair share levy is not going to push up the cost of gas. And it's a little bit unintuitive, I realise that. And so I'm going to take a second to explain why that is, because it's not intuitive, and that's reason enough to talk about it in my book. So when we think about taxes, typically, or levies or royalties, anything in that they increase the cost of production. The fair share levy does not in any way increase the cost of production. It's not the case that when a gas company looks at its books, it has changed the cost of inputs or labour or land or anything like that. It is a levy on profits. So companies still have the same incentive to produce at the same price, to trade, to produce the same quantities, to employ as many people, to invest. Those things are unchanged. It's just that when they do that, as you know, they are companies, they seek to profit maximize, given their costs, given demand. They seek to profit maximize under a fair share levy. The government, on behalf of all Australians, takes a bigger share of that back, of profits. We're not lifting costs. So I think it's absolutely crucial to make sure that we keep concepts about the fair share levy completely distinct and separate from conversations about the cost and availability of gas. Because one reason we favour this as a policy is because of these very neat kind of economic neutrality principles.
Just to add to it, Ingrid's excellent explanation. I mean, she said that the gas producers who are selling domestically are trying to sell for the highest possible price they can. We're not affecting their cost structure. Nothing's going to change in terms of the price. You know, if they want to use this as an excuse to raise prices, well, why didn't they raise prices before? So they're charging whatever they can now. It won't affect the price that they sell for.
Okay, thanks both. Look, I just wanted to zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture, what's going on in the world at the moment. It's fair to say in terms of climate and energy policy in some of the big economies, the world has changed a bit over the last year or two, particularly with Donald Trump's return to the White House, pulling the US, which is the biggest economy in the world, again out of the Paris Agreement. Even Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister, who has been a big advocate for climate change action, has gotten rid of Canada's consumer carbon tax. Yes, the world seems to be moving in a different direction at the moment. You're advocating almost sort of to double down and go aggressively on emissions reductions. Is there a risk that Australia sort of finds itself, I guess, stranded going against the flow and could hurt its own economy by going down this direction?
No, I don't think so.
Ooh, you go, Rod.
Sorry, I'll be quick, Ingrid, and give you a shot at this. The world is decarbonising, right? Whatever people say, that's what's happening. The rate of growth of fossil fuels production is going down. It's going to be negative very soon. We'll start having declines in fossil fuel production. And that's not based on people's commitments. That's just trends of what's going on in the world. So it is actually happening. There's been a massive reduction in emission intensity of economies, a massive reduction of emissions in the countries that we often compare ourselves to. So I think people can talk all they like, but people know that there is this problem, and so it's making it hard for them to invest in a range of things that increase emissions. I mean, look at China. China is adding to its stock of new generation. 80 to 90% of that is renewable energy. So whatever people say, and of course there's a lot of renewable energy going on in the US as well, because if you take Texas, it's just cheaper. And it's cheaper in India and a lot of other countries as well. So not only have you got to be careful if you invest in coal because you know what's going to happen, but it's also cheaper. So it's actually happening, John, just on an extrapolation of current trends. But Ingrid, have another shot.
Thank you for the question, John, because I think this is something a lot of people are wondering about. So clearly the international trade and political context has changed. But I think it's really important we don't get distracted by the noise and we focus on the substance of what is unchanged and what is substantial and what will drive the global pathway. More than 3/4 of global emissions are covered by net zero commitments for the central decades of the century, the mid-century. So, China 2060, India is later at 2070, Europe's slightly earlier for some countries in 2045. 3/4 of global emissions are covered by net zero commitments. That leads you, to perhaps wonder about the exact rate of decline or the specific year a country will get there. But the direction is absolutely clear. And that will get clearer for its own sake because the cost of renewables and storage, so firmed renewables, keeps coming down. It has dropped dramatically We are getting better at this. We will continue to get better at this and delivering low-cost, zero-carbon energy. So this is not a question of will it happen. It's not the case that in 100 years' time we're going to be having the same conversation. It has to happen. So that's the global context. But on the question of whether we're doubling down for Australia, all we are asking is for policies that deliver on existing commitments in the most economically responsible way. So we have a net zero commitment. We have 2035 targets that we have to meet. We have an international obligation to do that. And it absolutely serves Australia's interests if we can stand up on the international stage and point to the efforts that we are making, because more than almost any other country, Australia will benefit from global decarbonisation. That is because we wear a really high cost in the form of more extreme, more frequent devastating events, bushfires, floods, droughts, but it's also because it creates a tremendous opportunity for Australia to prosper, because it opens up the markets for those green exports that Rod described earlier. So it is crucial that Australia meets its existing commitments. We're not asking for anything new. We take these commitments seriously for domestic purposes, for international purposes, and we do it economically responsible, which means we find the low-cost abatement opportunities, we raise revenue to strengthen the budget, and we do it in a way that recognises we have to address productivity.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're going to do something, we need to do it in the least cost, most economically efficient kind of way. I think that's indisputable. Rod, just is the ambition for Australia to have some sort of green export, green iron, green hydrogen industry still a realistic one, given I think at the moment it appears at least we're struggling to generate enough electricity just domestically, for want of a better phrase, to keep the lights on. We're having to extend coal-fired power stations like Eraring. There's going to be enormous demand from data centres as well. I mean, is the idea that we could become an exporter of renewable energy and products linked to it still a realistic one?
Oh, yes, it is, John. The pressures facing the East Coast electricity grid are why we've got to get the incentives for generation change through the polluter pays levy, and that's really the answer to that problem. But in terms of the exports, we've never suggested you export hydrogen. That got thrown into the debate and has mightily confused things. Hydrogen is an input to production. You need hydrogen for green transport fuels, you need it for green iron. There are companies out there very close to final investment decision, or moving along that path for green transport fuels, for green iron. So these things take time. I mean, the green iron projects, 1 or 2 million, I got my curves right, 1 or 2 million tonnes per annum. I mean, they're sort of $10 to $18 billion projects. They take time to get going. You need to sort out Australia. I mean, the biggest threat to what you just described, John, the green energy intensive exports such as green iron and green transport fuel, is our approval system. I mean, if you're going to make green iron, you need not only approvals for a lot more renewable energy, but the plant itself, sometimes water desalination, sometimes transmission, sometimes ports. We've got to get our act together on that. And finally, most of these projects, John, are going to be located well away from the East Coast grid. I mean, what's our advantage here? Our advantage is renewable energy. Where's that best? Not in New South Wales and Victoria, I'm afraid. I mean, there'll be some projects there, don't get me wrong, but across the north, we can have capacity factors for wind and solar of about 70%. We've got renewable energy resources, combined wind and solar, the best of any country in the world. So that's our advantage. It's a long way away from the East Coast grid. Just as we make iron ore in Western Australia and we make a whole range of other things around the country, this is going to spread big projects, particularly in WA, Queensland, and we hope in South Australia as well.
We've got about 5 minutes before we wrap up. Bathan mentioned at the beginning of this call, Rod, that you and Ross Garnaut stood up at the press club a couple of years ago and put this proposal forward. You have tweaked or adjusted the model since then, particularly I think in relation to polluter pays levy. Could you just explain? Because I think there was, even from people who were sort of supportive of carbon pricing, myself included at the time, we did point out potentially there were some flaws, I think, around applying it to exports and things like that. Could you just take us through briefly about how you've adjusted the model and reflected a bit?
We've adjusted it to deal with the problem that you and others raised, John. So what we call then a carbon solutions levy, what the polluter pays levy is pretty much the same for domestic emissions. So that's the same. What we're not doing now is applying that to the emissions from our exports. Instead, we've come up with a fair share levy. We've done that because the criticism that was faced was that our original proposal might push up the prices, the international prices of those goods, which could have damaging effects to certain economies overseas and could also mean that our exports weren't as well accepted overseas. So what we've done is get rid of any pricing of emissions associated with exports and substituted the fair share levy, which actually does not affect prices or investment at all. So that's why the change occurred, John. We listened to the criticism and we adjusted.
Well, we've got a couple of minutes before we wrap up, so I'd like to give you both an opportunity just to summarise and conclude. And maybe, Ingrid, if I could start with you, what would your sort of closing thoughts and remarks be?
My closing thoughts and remarks would be that we have an opportunity, essentially, here. I'm a pretty boring classic economist. I have spent a long time thinking about the proposals we're putting forward today. They take existing policy commitments really seriously. They reduce emissions far more than any current policies on the table. When we looked at the PPL, we were looking at the additional reductions that we would get. Our policy about doubles the cumulative emissions reductions in the first decade that you get compared to current policy settings. That's important. That takes current policy commitments seriously, and it does it in a way that returns revenues to households and strengthens the budget. And that's important to me as an economist and someone who wants the government to be well positioned, not just for the things that we have as existing commitments, but also so that we're a resilient economy that can deal with unexpected surprises, the COVIDs, the trade fluctuations. It sounds wonky, it sounds boring, it sounds dry, but a strong budget is incredibly important. And so it matters to me that this policy does both of those things. It reduces emissions, it strengthens the budget, it looks after households, and it does it in a way that's incredibly economically efficient.
How hopeful are you that the Albanese government will actually seriously pick up and consider this piece of work? They seem to be heading in a different direction at the moment, even though they are aiming for sizable emissions reductions. The mechanism of getting there is different.
John, I think let the debate unfold. Let there be wide discussion amongst the community. We've got the polling, which shows the political popularity. I guess the question I'd be putting to anyone who opposes the two proposals we've got, the fair share levy and the polluter pays levy, is, okay, if you don't want those policies, how else are you going to reduce emissions? And let's understand the relative costs of that. How else are you going to fix the budget deficit? How else are you going to get tax reform? Just explain that. So you can't just say no to this. You've got to say, what's your alternative to address emission reduction, budget repair, and productivity? And I look forward to hearing those answers, John.
Rod and Ingrid, look, thanks so much. It's been a really meaty, enjoyable discussion today. I'm going to hand back to Bathan now for closing remarks.
Thanks so much, John, for your hosting of this event. The questions were fantastic, so we really appreciate your time. And thank you also to the audience today. We had an excellent turnout, I think, which demonstrates the level of interest in this work and in these policies and in this policy space, which is encouraging to see. If you'd like further information on our report, The Case for Pricing Pollution, please visit our website. There'll be another webinar on Monday, the 2nd of February, with Ingrid and Ruben Finnegan, the other report's co-author, on this research. And for those of you who may wish to ask questions about the work, you'll have that opportunity on Monday. Again, thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.